have data for pregnant women. We have all those women who were pregnant, getting pregnant, delivering babies, and we did not have data about safety, about vaccines, about exposure, about management. And it was a really tremendous and terrifying lesson about how when we don't have data, of course, appropriately, safely, and we'll hear about that in a moment, for women in pregnancy, it has important risks to the health of our population. So when we talk about the health of women beyond reproductive and maternal health, we need to think about, this is infectious disease health as well. So to address that, I'm going to turn this first to my colleague, Dr. Kaveeta Vasisht from the FDA, and to ask her in her role overseeing all of women's health at the FDA, what do we mean by women's health? How do you see it in terms of the FDA role?
Thank you, Hadine, and really a pleasure to be here. Can everyone hear me okay? So as Hadine mentioned, so my role is I'm the Associate Commissioner for Women's Health at the FDA, and in that role I also direct the Office of Women's Health. So what does that mean? The FDA is a huge organization. I think we might have maybe 18,000 employees. Those of you that are in medical product development probably intersect with our centers. So the Center for Drugs, Center for Biologics, Center for Devices, that's where the medical product review happens and where approval or non-approval happens. Where my office sits is we sit in the office of the commissioner. So we're a direct report to the commissioner, and we are not making the product-specific decisions, but what we are doing is driving the policy. We are engaged in research, supporting research, advancing a women's health agenda for FDA. A big priority for our office is representation in clinical trials. We were actually created 30 years ago because women were not being represented in clinical trials. And while we've seen progress, our office continues to work in that space. My background is I'm an adult endocrinologist by training, and I'm still, up until very recently, was still practicing in clinic. So your question was, how do we look at women? And I think as the science has evolved, our understanding of women's health and the definition of women's health has evolved as a community. Well, of course, reproductive health and gynecologic health is critically important. What we've realized is that with the evolution of scientific understanding is that males and females are not the same. And it's also important to think about sex and gender. They are not the same, right? Your biological sex and your gender, which is more of a social construct, are unique, but do intersect in how we experience health, disease, and respond to treatment. So we know that there are conditions that disproportionately impact women. I probably don't have to tell you guys all of this, right? Autoimmune diseases, 80% are impacted by women. Osteoporosis, depression, 2 times as likely as in women. But there's also diseases that behave differently in women. So women are more likely to die from a heart attack. Women with diabetes are more likely to have serious complications. And so what we do in the Office of Women's Health is to make sure everybody's thinking about that. We need to understand the biologic differences so that clinical trials can be better informed. Now, FDA looks at sex differences. Those of you that have been engaged in product development know this throughout the medical product pipeline in terms of when the data comes in preclinical, we do look at the sex differences in the animals. You have to, if a medical product is going to be developed and used in both men and women, there has to be representation of male and female animals. And then when you look at as you move into the clinical phases, sex differences can impact everything from your PK, right? Absorption, distribution, metabolism, and elimination, so that there's concentration differences, to your pharmacodynamics, which is the dose-response relationship. So we're looking at that, as well as the safety and effectiveness and any adverse events. And we're also looking at that in the post-marketing stage. We also in OWH want to make sure our reviewers are thinking about that. So just today I was talking to my team earlier, we developed a 3-part course to educate FDA reviewers on looking at sex differences. And so for the past 3 weeks, we've been focusing on everything from the preclinical. Last week was all the clinical stuff, and today we're ending in the post-marketing space, because once the medical product is out there, you can also gain more information. So did that answer your question?
Yeah, okay. That's very helpful. Thank you. And I might actually ask Tazeen, from your perspective and seeing from Bank of America's perspective and the finance investor perspective, how do you appraise and ascertain data in terms of looking at clinical trial enrollment? Mm-hmm. How do you take that into consideration?
You know, it depends on the indication. You all are much more expert at treating patients than, you know, most people, especially paying attention to specifics around how women may or may not respond. So when investors look at clinical data, for example, regardless if it's an ailment that only affects women, but let's say it's heart disease, let's say it's diabetes, let's say it's cholesterol, people look at the distribution of a clinical trial makeup, meaning what percent of the study included women. They look to see the demographics, they look to see the age distribution, and they look to see how that compares to the males that are enrolled in the study to make sure that there's no disproportionate response that could be ascertained, or an incorrect response potentially that could be ascertained. I think that's becoming much more common. You know, certainly in the last 5 years, those are questions that when I talk to our client base, who tend to be pension funds, hedge funds, investors, things of that nature, they're always talking about making sure that the population of clinical trials looks representative of how a drug is going to be used. So I consider that a step in the positive direction.
Yeah. Thank you. That's really helpful. I now want to pass it to my colleague, Dr. Nawal Nour, who's chair of the OBGYN department at Brigham Women's Hospital. And I wonder if you could comment a bit more about some of the unmet needs that you see, diseases where you really see we need more growth and innovation and options for diagnostics and treatment for women.
Great. Thanks so much, Hadine. I mean, I think that you brought up COVID, and I think COVID was such a great opportunity for our field in OBGYN because unlike other fields where we could tell patients that they could stay at home, pregnant patients had to come into the hospital nonstop. And it really got us to look at the pregnancy as a whole. How often do they actually need to come to the hospital? How can we deliver home care for our pregnant patients? And then it got us to sort of start translating it, much like the other departments, where how do we provide care at home all the time? Really, if you think about yourselves as patients, do you really want to come to a hospital? Do you want to stay in the hospital? Do you want to come to the emergency department? And so thinking from a diagnostic perspective, as we look at some of the fields of ultrasound, for example, can we do these ultrasounds in areas that are close to home, or actually can we start thinking about doing ultrasounds at home? And there are actually companies that are starting to think about this. Can we do non-stress tests, which is monitoring the baby at home? Again, really trying to do as much as we can to keep patients where they should be, which is at home. I think other aspects, if we think about OBGYN, we also do the GYN side, and I know, Keith, you'll talk a little bit about endometriosis and the work that you do. But if we think about cancer, for example, we really want to be able to think of methods of diagnosis prior to obtaining ovarian cancer or cervical cancer or endometrial cancer, and sort of really thinking about the diagnostic aspects of that, and the research that has been going through has been very positive on that aspect, but really like home care is critical. About a couple of days ago, I was listening to NPR, and one of the things that struck me was the story of when they were building highways, they thought, oh, if we're so congested, if we could just add a few more lanes, and this was thinking about LA, if we could add a few more lanes, then the traffic will improve. And what they found with the data is the more lanes they built, the more congested things got. And it demonstrated to me, as I was thinking about it, I was like, this is great for our talk, because the same thing's happening with our emergency departments. As we think about our patients coming to the emergency department, think, well, let's build a bigger emergency department. Let's bring it bigger, because then patients can be seen. But that puts stress on the hospitals, and it puts stress on the health providers. And I would say one more thing, which is our women surgeons and physicians are the ones that are starting to get much more burnout than our male surgeons, because they spend more time with their female patients, as well as patients who have long-term disabilities. And so thinking about, again, keeping the patients at home so that they don't come to the emergency departments. We don't have to build larger emergency departments. In fact, how do we keep the patients at home is, I think, the best methods.
Yeah, thank you. Really important points about the state of intensive and tertiary care, and the need to expand into the home and into other spaces, and also to have women be able to implement some of these diagnostics themselves, to have accessible opportunities. So there really is, this is an extraordinary time in the field of women's health innovation, and I wanted to turn this to my colleague, Dr. Keith Isaacson, who's a gynecologist and gynecologic surgeon, who's at Wellesley and also doing important innovative work related to, he'll tell you about it, surgical diagnostics innovation at MIT. And if you could talk a little bit, Keith, about some of the bleeding disorders, vaginal bleeding disorders that you've seen that affect pelvic disease, chronic diseases, and where some opportunities, innovation, where the need is there.
So thank you, Hadine, again for inviting me here and to be part of this esteemed panel. I'm kind of at the bottom of the food chain. I'm a very busy practicing minimally invasive GYN surgeon, did my fellowship in reproductive endocrinology and infertility, and really have seen as a surgeon the unmet needs for women really since 1989. So understand in gynecology, much of our, many of the tools that we've been using were not developed really for gynecologic purposes. They were developed for either urology or general surgery, and then they were kind of handed down to the gynecologist. So since 1989, I've been involved in at least 5 different startups for just small medical devices that are not what you would call revolutionary. They just take devices that are used every single day, and they're specifically tailored for gynecologic surgery. And it's made a big difference. And then we've also focused, as you were just alluding to, on some of the diseases that really impact women in a much, much greater capacity than it's appreciated by anyone. So, for example, if we take a disease such as endometriosis, which is a benign condition that causes very extreme pain, it can cause fertility issues, it can cause heavy bleeding if it involves the uterus. It's a disease right now that takes up to 7 years for a woman who has it to get a diagnosis. So for 7 years, they're suffering with pain and bleeding, and it turns out that 15% of all adolescents or all women in high school miss 1 or 2 days a month because of heavy pain and bleeding. And that happens, and they were told this is just normal. It turns out it's not normal. It turns out we just didn't know to look for the right disease. So there's no animal model for this particular disease of endometriosis and adenomyosis. So I started a collaboration with Professor Linda Griffith at MIT to come up with an in vitro model so that we can actually build this disease and study it in the lab. And since 2009, we're still in the process of building that model, because endometriosis is not a cancer. It's not a pre-cancer, but it doesn't make it a benign disease. It's a very malignant disease because it impacts the quality of life of women. And there's very little funding from NIH or industry of diseases in women's health that are non-pregnancy or non-cancer related. So it's hard to get funding for endometriosis and adenomyosis, which again impacts so many more women as far as pain, bleeding, and fertility than any of the other diseases combined. So this has been my focus and my passion really since 1989, and it's been very exciting. It's very difficult as a busy clinician to do this work, again, because the whole funding of our positions has kind of changed in academic medicine, where it used to be you were given a salary and you had research time and you can do these things. Now we're actually paid based on RVUs, based on the work that we produce. So we don't have the time anymore to put into these clinical problems on a research basis as we used to have. So it all kind of comes together as the perfect storm, and that's where we are now.
Yeah, thank you. I think endometriosis is a really great example of a disease that has a huge unmet need, huge burden, diagnostics that are perhaps less invasive than the laparoscopic diagnostics that are involved. There's a lot of interest in that field, and there are some of the other fields in women's health where there's a lot of interest is a condition called polycystic ovarian syndrome, or PCOS, where we're understanding more about the brain, the ovarian, and also endocrine function that are underlying this condition. My own field is menopause health and menopause brain health, and that is another area where there's, in the last 10 years, there's been huge discovery, understanding the neurotransmitter processes, neuroendocrine processes in the brain that drive hot flashes or vasomotor symptoms, which are the core symptoms. And there's been a number of companies that have come forward and developing neurokinin B antagonists. These are examples of ways in which diagnostics and therapeutics are growing as we understand the biology. As Keith said, you need to have the resources from the scientists and clinicians to do the work in order to bring these ideas forward to the market. And I want to have Dr. Nour comment on one other thing before I want to ask Dr. Alice Zhang to comment further in terms of market forces. But the question for Nawal, if you could comment a little bit further about areas where there's also been growth in terms of like cervical cancer, prevention, diagnostics, just to sort of highlight some of the areas there.
Yeah, I think, thanks for the question. I think that when we look at the sort of the history of cervical cancer and how we have been looking at diagnosis, you know, initially it was the pap smear, and then if there was an abnormal pap smear, we would need to do colposcopy, which we would bring the patient back and we'd take a look at the cervix, and then we might need to do a biopsy, and then if there's something, then we need to do maybe shave off the top part of the cervix. And that's thinking again about our patients and how many times they have to come into a clinic or the hospital if they need the procedure. And in the past, they would go under anesthesia for all of this. So you see a very clunky type of care. In time, our pap smears have sort of shifted over, and now we do HPV testing. And then there was the vaccine. And the vaccine was incredibly expensive, but it was being rolled out. It was initially rolled out to teenagers up to a certain age, and then that age expanded, and then we think, okay, now we can vaccinate the boys. And I just came from a meeting yesterday where they talked about the description of, you know, how expensive the vaccine was, but we really want to take care of women, not just girls and women here, we want to take care of girls and women globally. And so how the price of the vaccine has now dropped to being under $1, so that in other nations, we're actually taking care of people locally, nationally, and internationally. And then going back to, you know, my motto, which is take care of patients at home, there's more and more evidence that we can actually try to do these HPV tests at home so that the patient actually can do her own self-test. It hasn't been approved yet, but that's exciting news, right? Again, the patient can do it all by herself and then send the test in. So I think when you think about where we were and where we're going, it's a very exciting time for cervical cancer.
Yeah, thank you. So to Dr. Zhang, you know, you're somebody who is both a physician and also an MBA, who is principal at RH Capital, and we'll have you talk about that in a minute. You've done some really interesting and important landscape analysis about disequity in investment in diseases affecting women. And I wonder if you can comment and describe some of that work that you did at McKinsey and some of the work you're doing as well now.
Yeah, thank you, and great to join everybody here. I'm here to represent the venture capital industry. As Hadine mentioned, I started my career in clinical medicine. I was an aspiring OBGYN, so very much wanted to follow in your footsteps. I ended up going the business route, have an MBA, went to consulting for 5 years with McKinsey, and then for the past 3 years, I've been a VC investor with a fund called RH Capital. Although today's a big day because we are announcing a rebrand and relaunch to Foreground Capital, which you will all be hearing about soon. Our fund is entirely focused on women's health, meaning that all of our investments are in companies that are treating or working on solutions for female-specific conditions, which admittedly is part of women's health, but women's health is actually larger than female-specific issues. So for our next fund, we will be expanding to all of those other areas. Our fund, just to introduce, we have about 40 million under management and 22 portfolio companies, which does make us the largest dedicated portfolio in women's health. And while we are very focused on specific disease areas, such as endometriosis, maternal health, et cetera, we're very broad across segments. So we are investing across the life sciences, which means therapeutics, devices, and diagnostics, as well as tech-enabled services, digital health, and even consumer products. So when I think about innovation, it's really kind of across all of that. Just take a step back about some of the landscaping I did in my previous role at McKinsey. Being at a firm that serves Fortune 500 companies, I really got to see the landscape. And there really weren't too many, I would say, clients at McKinsey among the Fortune 500 in women's health. It's really a growing and nascent sector, but there was a lot of excitement in the innovation economy, meaning startups, even funds. So for me, I made that transition about 3 years ago after studying the landscape and seeing, even 5 years ago, there were a couple hundred startups. Now there are multiple thousands. From a fund perspective, at that time that I transitioned into venture, there were small handful of funds interested. Now there's dedicated funds in women's health. There's big generalist funds that are making many, many bets in the space, for example, Google Ventures, and many more. So it's definitely a really exciting time. And just to touch on a couple of themes that have been mentioned already, and I love just pulling it all together, is healthcare at home. So one of the big themes that we do invest in is care that is accessible. So within our portfolio, we have a company doing vaginal microbiome testing at home. You get the swab, you swab yourself, you send it in. We have a company developing an STI test at home. So same idea, swab at home, send it out. And we have other companies that even get results at home. So we have a company developing hormone testing, so cortisol, progesterone, estradiol. It's saliva-based. You take the test at home, and then you also get the results at home. So there definitely is a theme around home diagnostics, as well as, I would say, home care delivery as well. Some of our companies are leveraging telehealth so that patients don't have to go into the hospital all the time. Also remote monitoring. We have a company developing a device that can actually, once having FDA clearance, do an NST in pregnancy in home. So lots of the themes that we're hearing about in the clinic are actually things that we're seeing out in the market from an innovation standpoint.
Hadine, can I think there's a missed opportunity between the home and the hospital, which is office-based medicine. And we are now doing a tremendous number of procedures that were done in the OR, which require general anesthesia, taking time off for the day, everything that comes with OR, scheduling, costs, and bringing them into the office. And we do them in the office without anesthesia. It takes less than 5 minutes to do the procedure, and the patient walks off the table and goes home. But we're having a hard time getting industry to invest in that space. So right now, 100% of urologists do office cystoscope, so they look in the bladder. Maybe 20% of gynecologists will do the same in the office to look inside the uterus. And there's a lot more uterine pathology than there is in the bladder. So again, it's an opportunity that as a clinician, I'm having a hard time finding companies that want to invest in that space, and I don't understand why.
On that point, Dr. Isaacson, I was curious to get your thought about certain things that still require multiple steps. So for example, if you ask a patient to get an ultrasound because you want to rule out any particular abnormality, in most places you have to go to the hospital, to the tech who does the ultrasound. Is there a way that you envision in the future where it can be part of a single visit to your office? And maybe some doctors are doing it themselves, but increasingly we see it, when we talk to physicians about multi-step processes.
That time has come. So about 80% of my patients would come in from out of town. So that means that puts pressure on us. Everything's got to get done. So when they come in, they get their consult, they get their ultrasound, they get the procedure, and they go home. And all that takes less than an hour.
How has that changed since before, and why do you think it's changed?
It hasn't changed enough. It's very rare that we have centers like that in the United States. There's a center like that in 2 of them in Italy, As far as I know, we're the only ones in the United States where it's like that. So I agree with you. I don't have the answer as why that's not more common. Part of it's training, part of it's understanding, you know, the gynecologist has to, it's not getting an ultrasound technician. You have to be able to do it and look at it yourself and be able to talk to the patient. So it is, we've established it's very doable, it's very cost effective, it's very rewarding for the physician, it's very rewarding for the patient. So it's a win-win for everyone. It's just a matter of how do you spread that knowledge.
Do you think there are enough physicians to care for the needs of patients? Because the other thing that we hear more and more is that wait lists to go see doctors are getting longer and longer.
Why don't you address that?
Well, I think this goes back to the point, which is, and you are exactly right, you know, again, it's that congestion model that I'm trying to explain, which is, you know, we are put under a lot of pressure to see more patients faster and bring them in quicker. But in the end, no matter how many physicians we can hire, or PAs, physician assistants, or others, we just can't seem to cope with the volume of patients. And so this is why it should be in different areas, right? You know, pushing the patients maybe away from the hospitals, the big academic medical centers, to community hospitals, to clinics, to home, you know, and so that we diversify the way we care for our patients so that they don't always need the cookie cutter method of providing care. And so I think that's sort of the other angle. I always talk about diversity because I was the Chief Diversity Inclusion Officer, but I also want to say that diversity in care is really critical in how we provide care, because not every patient wants to be cared for the same way, and we have to meet patients where they're at.
Yes, do you want to comment?
I just want to add one point, and I don't want to add more work to clinical practice. I totally understand that. But ultimately, we want to get innovative products, safe and effective products to women, right? And the only way we're going to really understand is if they're in the clinical trials. And the community is a great place to recruit if we can have a paradigm shift in the clinical research infrastructure, which is really housed in big academic medical centers. You know, I remember when I was doing clinical trials, we were looking kind of around us, but if we can get the community to be engaged in clinical research, that is a great way to enroll people in clinical trials. Now, you know, as clinicians, it's very hard, we don't have time, but it's something that we need to think about. And it's particularly important in pregnancy, because right now when medical products are approved, they're approved for the general population, which includes pregnant women. If you look at the clinical labels for a lot of these products, it's animal data. So unless there's a contraindication or warning, the products are being used. Now, many women who are pregnant need to be on medications for chronic conditions or because of an illness that develops during pregnancy. Great opportunity to get information. There are pregnancy registries, there's way to get opportunistic data in this population. So I'm going to pause there, but when we talk about the community, I think there's a role to enhance research there to ultimately get women the therapeutics that they need.
Yeah, that's a really important point, because we are all trying to stimulate women of all backgrounds, for women to be more involved in clinical trials, and women of all backgrounds who have these conditions. We know, for instance, that fibroids is more common in African American women. We need the enrollment in clinical trials to be more representative of the people who will receive these treatments. I do want to highlight that there's just been real extraordinary interest in investing in the health of women, therapeutics and diagnostics. There are a few like signature investments even over the last year, just to highlight, and I'll ask others to comment further. The White House initiative, which has declared this as a major priority, and that led to about $250 million of investment through federal agencies, and also $100 million to ARPA-H to invest in women's health under what's called Sprint for Women's Health, a number of different areas there. And that is really at the interface of science, clinical care, and therapeutics that are, like Nawal said, home-based, accessible, affordable, in diseases that affect women. I will highlight also locally some of the things that we do in this research center that I run. Is we lead an initiative called First in Women. It's a play on the term first in man or first in women, the notion that when we are developing new diagnostics or therapeutics, that we be certain to include female-specific and female-differentiating data. And we have worked and partnered across with the Massachusetts, the governor, economics secretary here, where they've been investing substantially in seeing through the Mass Life Science Center the unmet need in innovation related to the health of women. They're trying to stimulate investment locally in bioscience and venture efforts locally within Massachusetts. And I know there are a number of initiatives that are out there in other states as well. Alice and Kaveeta and others, I wonder if you want to comment a little bit further on that, the innovation space, and where you see really a call to action and areas of great identification and prioritization.
Sure, yeah, happy to go first. And it's a really exciting time for women's health, is what I'll say. We are really at a precipice, at least from the investing perspective, where there's just been explosion in the number of companies that are being formed, amount of investment. Despite a VC downturn, we are actually in like a 7 to 10 year low right now in VC investing, yet women's health investing is still elevated multiple times compared to pre-COVID levels. Also, I mentioned earlier, there's increased fund interest, corporate interest as well. So it's a very exciting time, even though it is actually quite challenging overall right now in the innovation economy. I did want to comment on one thing you asked earlier that I realized I failed to answer, which is what are the trends in investing in women's health? And when I was in my prior role, I did do an analysis of clinical trial research and what therapeutic areas that is in. And what we found was that there are certain areas that have increased level of investment year over year, especially in oncology, for example, to the earlier point. Whereas if you look at conditions that affect women specifically, so this is not all of the others, but just female-specific conditions, that comprises about 4% of the pharmaceutical pipeline that's in clinical trials. If you take away oncology within women's health, and it's about 1%. So if you think about all those conditions that affect women specifically, infertility, endometriosis, all of these together amount to a very small part of the therapeutic pipeline. To investors, that actually represents opportunity, because in what other area that you invest in, would there be literally no other competitors, which is quite incredible, especially compared to the vast need that there is in these areas. The last thing I'll say about investing trends and innovation is that since we are looking across all the different segments, there is more I would say recent energy around digital health and services, which solves some parts of women's health issues, or maybe not solves, just targets, such as healthcare at home. But there's a lot of other conditions where it's really about new diagnostics and therapeutics, like endometriosis, like PCOS, and there are fewer innovations there, and I think we really need to go back to the basic science. If we don't have new science and new developments and new understanding of the biology, then it's hard to develop new diagnostics and therapeutics. Within that, we do see many more therapeutics than many more diagnostics and therapeutics. So I really am hopeful for some of these new initiatives that are funding some of that early research, so that hopefully in a short number of years we will have more therapeutics to invest in as well.
Tazeen, do you want to comment on that? That's a really important point.
Yeah, I agree 100% with what Alice is saying. I mean, sometimes we've seen women's health be the beneficiary of a broader effort. So targeted oncology, for example, going back to oncology. Now, people are looking for specific gene mutations, not just BRCA, but many other things now, because of early stage companies that decided that they wanted to treat cancer based on whatever the individual's tumor was expressing. And so there are certain gene mutations that are much more common in women, and so they've been a beneficiary in that aspect. And as it relates to oncology, I'm happy to say that the majority of the cancer companies that I look at, ovarian cancer has always been at the top of the list, for example, of areas that they want to focus on, breast cancer, of course. I will say, outside of oncology, there's probably a couple that I would highlight. Biogen and Sage recently launched a drug to treat postpartum depression. I think it's the first one specifically for that type of depression, and they're still in the early innings of the launch. And I'm sure, Hadine, you can give some feedback as to what you've heard about that treatment. The other one that comes to mind is a few years now back, AbbVie launched Oralissa, which is to treat endometriosis and uterine fibroids. And I do remember seeing DTC ads on TV to educate women about those conditions. Maybe Dr. Isaacson, you have a view on that drug, but those are some of the more prominent recent drug launches and discovery efforts that I think have been, targeted to not just women, but areas that where women had no previous options. And we are looking at other companies that are trying to do similar things that might be still several years away, but it's good that they are trying it. And we're going to look for the companionship of diagnostics and drug treatment to kind of drive that in the future.
Yeah, thank you. And you bring up some other related points, areas we haven't talked about so much. Contraception, unmet need there, where not every woman can take the highly effective hormonal treatments, and they don't have other benefits for STD prevention and so forth. Also, huge concerns about maternal morbidity and mortality, where being able to understand best strategies for care and diagnostics and treatment. I wonder, Nawal, if you can comment a bit more on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, maternal mortality, if any of you have been following the data, as in the US, we're not doing so well on maternal mortality compared to other Western nations. And our Black and brown women are 3 times more likely to die during pregnancy or childbirth in the US. So again, our data is really pretty stark when we compare ourselves with other Western countries. And I think that when we think about how to prevent many of these issues, some of them are implicit bias, and systemic racism within the system. So as patients come in, no matter what their education status is or socioeconomic status, Black and brown women are still have a higher likelihood of dying during pregnancy and childbirth. And so how do we think about the system aspects, but also how do we ensure that patients have the education, but also the diagnostics to be able to either follow their blood pressures at home, ensure that they have testing at home that puts them at risk for some of these things, such as preeclampsia, and then ultrasound, going back to that, how do we make it easy for patients to have ultrasounds so that if they have any placental issues that might put them at a risk for maternal mortality. So all these things, as we look at the future of decreasing this number in the US, really puts the unmet need is truly there, and there's a lot of opportunity to make change.
Yeah, thank you.
If I can comment just on one thing that you said. Right now with contraception, with endometriosis, we're actually giving women these high doses of hormonal therapy that have a tremendous number of side effects, and often the side effects are worse than the disease or what have you. So we need a paradigm shift to rethink how we treat that. So the Oralissa is a great drug, but it puts you into menopause, and there aren't many women in their 20s and 30s that want the side effects of menopause, even though it does help with the pain. And so there are other ways that we need to think about how do we treat this without just completely disturbing the hormonal milieu within a patient. If you look at the contraception, at the time we had a contraceptive device, if you remember the Essure device that went into the tube to block the fallopian tubes. Well, because of lawsuits, they had to pull that off the market, but it was actually a very effective device. And it had no hormonal component to it. So again, if we can kind of go back to rethinking some of these devices that will actually improve women's quality of life.
Actually, to tag on there, within our fund, we have invested in numerous contraceptive companies, and they're all non-hormonal, exactly for the reason that you mentioned. Hormonal contraceptives have done really well and solved a lot of needs, but there still are other needs that remain, and most of the innovation in the past 50 years has been different delivery mechanisms of the same hormones, and so we specifically look for male contraceptives, female ones that are non-hormonal, and also for endometriosis. We've looked at probably 15 companies doing different types of diagnostics, and also a couple of therapeutics that are also all non-hormonal and disease modifying, so definitely an area that is small but growing.
Yeah, Kaveeta, can you comment further from the FDA perspective on bringing some of these therapeutics forward.
Yeah, well, before I get, I wanted to comment really quickly on the White House initiative for a
Yeah,
second.
please.
And what I think it's done is galvanized and shed a spotlight on women's health. We're 51, 52 maybe % of the population. Like, there should not be we should be investing in women's health, right? And so menopause and midlife health are talked about more. So I think that that's something that's tapped in with the White House initiative. I think in terms of medical product development, I think there's mechanisms to come talk to the agency if you have questions, if you have an idea, and we're always interested in bringing new and innovative products that are safe and effective forward. I feel like we're running out of time, so
We are, yeah. I want to give Tazeen an opportunity to help, conclude and thank everybody. So.
Yeah, thanks everybody for coming. Hope this was a good use of your time. I'm sure the space will continue to evolve, and hopefully when we meet again next year at this time to talk about the same topic, we'll have a lot of new things that have happened in the interim.